Let me ask you something. What if I told you there was a country, not that long ago, that was officially described by a major US government agency as a bottomless pit? Meaning, no matter how much money you pour in, it's a waste. A country so poor that its average income per person was lower than some of the poorest nations in Africa. A country that was completely flattened by war. Buildings gone, farms gone, everything gone. That country is now the 11th largest economy in the world, and it happened in just 70 years. That country is South Korea. And today, I'm going to tell you exactly how they did it. You probably already know Korea in some way. Maybe through the music, BTS topping the Billboard charts in the United States, Blackpink becoming the first Asian act to headline Coachella, one of the biggest music festivals in America. Maybe through the shows, Korean dramas and movies reaching the top of Netflix in countries all over the world. Or maybe through the products you use every day. Samsung, LG, Hyundai. These aren't just Korean brands anymore, they're global giants. Korea controls about 20% of the global semiconductor market. Its trade volume ranks 8th in the world. And if you've ever used a smartphone, driven a car, or watched a screen, there's a good chance Korea had something to do with it. Now here's the thing. None of this was supposed to happen. When you look at where Korea started, where it actually came from, the fact that it exists as a modern, developed nation today is genuinely one of the most remarkable stories in the history of the world. To understand Korea's rise, you have to go back to August 15th, 1945. For 35 years, Korea had been under Japanese colonial rule. And on that day, Japan surrendered to the Allied forces, ending the Second World War, and Korea was finally free. People poured into the streets, they cried, they cheered. After 35 years, they could breathe again. But the joy didn't last long, because two of the world's most powerful nations, the United States and the Soviet Union, made a decision about Korea without asking Koreans. They drew a line across the middle of the peninsula, the 38th parallel. North of the line, Soviet influence. South of the line, American influence. It was supposed to be temporary. Everyone assumed Korea would reunify soon. But the Cold War changed everything. By 1948, two completely separate governments had formed, one in the north, one in the south. And 2 years later, everything fell apart. June 25th, 1950, 4 in the morning. North Korean forces, backed by the Soviet Union and China, launched a surprise invasion of the South. What followed was 3 years of some of the most brutal fighting of the 20th century. Cities were leveled, villages were burned, families were torn apart, permanently. When the guns finally stopped, an armistice was signed on July 27, 1953. The damage was almost impossible to describe. 80% of Korea's industrial and public infrastructure had been completely destroyed. Roughly 600,000 homes were gone. The entire country looked like the surface of the moon. General Douglas MacArthur, who commanded UN forces during the war, looked out over the ruins of Seoul and said, "It will take this country at least 100 years to recover." Korea's per capita income in 1953? $67 per year. For context, that was lower than Ghana, lower than many countries in sub-Saharan Africa. The US Agency for International Development, which was sending aid to Korea, officially described the country as a bottomless pit, as in, don't bother, there's no point. But here's where the story gets interesting. Before we get to the comeback, I want you to understand just how bad things were. Because I think people hear poverty and they picture something abstract. So let me make it real. Through the early 1960s, Korea experienced something called boritgoge, which roughly translates to the lean season. Here's what that means. In Korean farming communities, the harvest from the previous autumn would run out around May or June. But the new harvest wasn't ready yet. That gap, those weeks or months, was the hardest time of year. Families would eat grass roots and tree bark just to survive. It got bad enough that the government launched national campaigns telling people to mix their rice with cheaper grains, barley, wheat, anything to stretch it further. And they weren't just suggesting it. Teachers at schools would open children's lunchboxes and check whether the rice had been properly mixed with other grains. If a child brought pure white rice to school, that was a problem. Restaurants were told they could only serve mixed grain meals on certain days. This is the country that now exports the most advanced memory chips in the world. That gap is what makes this story so extraordinary. So, how did they turn it around? Let me walk you through it. In the early 1960s, the United States began reducing its financial aid to Korea. The money that Korea had been surviving on was starting to dry up. The country had to figure out how to stand on its own. This is when a man named Park Chung-hee came to power. Now, Park is one of the most controversial figures in Korean history. He came to power through a military coup. His government was authoritarian. Human rights were violated. Political opposition was suppressed. These are facts that cannot be ignored. But in terms of economic strategy, he made a choice that almost no other developing nation was making at the time. Most poor countries in the 1960s chose what economists call import substitution. Basically, building walls around your economy, protecting domestic industries, and trying to produce everything yourself. Korea went the opposite direction. Park's strategy was simple: export, sell to the world, earn foreign currency, build an economy that competes globally, not one that hides from it. It sounds obvious now, but back then, with no technology, no capital, and no infrastructure, it was an enormous gamble. So what was Korea's first move? People. In 1963, the Korean government made a deal with West Germany. At the time, West Germany was in the middle of its own post-war economic boom. The miracle on the Rhine, they called it. The German economy was growing fast, but there weren't enough workers for the hard, dangerous jobs: mining, nursing, manual labor. Koreans volunteered to go. Roughly 7,900 Korean miners went underground in German coal mines. About 10,000 Korean nurses work in German hospitals, often night shifts, often in the hardest conditions. They sent their wages back home. And Korea earned approximately $15 million a year from this arrangement. That might not sound massive, but it was equivalent to 2% of Korea's entire GDP at the time. That was the seed money, the first real injection of foreign currency into the Korean economy. But what came next was even bigger. From September 1964, Korea sent more than 300,000 soldiers to fight in the Vietnam War, alongside the United States. Now, this is one of the most debated decisions in Korean history. Politically and ethically, it's deeply complicated. Many historians and Koreans themselves continue to debate its morality. But economically, the numbers are what they are. Through the Vietnam War period, Korea earned approximately $5 billion in foreign currency. That includes American military payments, soldiers' wages sent home, and contracts won by Korean companies: construction, logistics, supply. Companies that got their start building infrastructure in Vietnam would go on to become some of Korea's most important corporations. The foundations of what we now call Korea's major industrial groups, its conglomerates, were laid here. Korea's economic growth rate, which was 7.2% in 1954, climbed to 10% by 1970. Per capita income nearly doubled in the span of a single decade. For a country that was eating tree bark 15 years earlier, this was almost unthinkable. When the Vietnam War ended and the money stopped flowing from that direction, Korea looked for the next opportunity. They found it in the Middle East. In the 1970s, oil-rich nations across the region were sitting on enormous wealth, and they wanted to build highways, harbors, housing, gas facilities. Korean construction companies, with strong government backing, went in and competed aggressively for contracts. Harbor construction in Saudi Arabia, gas facilities, residential developments, some of the largest infrastructure projects in the world at the time. This became known in Korea as the Middle East boom. And by 1979, Korea's GDP per capita had reached $1,700. Think about that for a second. In 1953, it was $67. In 1979, it was $1,700 in 26 years. But fast growth has consequences. To fuel all of this expansion, the government was printing money aggressively. And in the 1970s, two global oil crises hit at the same time. The result was severe inflation. The economy on paper was growing, but ordinary people were feeling the squeeze of rising prices every single day. By the early 1980s, Korea's growth rate had actually turned negative, -2%. The new government stabilized things through harsh measures, freezing spending, holding down wages, building up energy reserves. And then in the mid-1980s, something remarkable happened. Three things fell at once in Korea's favor. Interest rates dropped, oil prices dropped, the value of the Korean currency dropped, making Korean exports cheaper and more competitive globally. Economists called this the three lows boom. Korea exploded back onto the global stage. By 1989, electronics exports alone reached $18 billion. By 1990, Korea was being talked about in the same breath as Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, the four Asian tigers, economies that had defied every expectation. In 1964, Korea had crossed $100 million in annual exports for the first time. By 1995, just 31 years later, Korea crossed $100 billion. And in 1996, Korea's per capita income hit $10,000, and the country was admitted as the 29th member of the OECD, the club of the world's advanced economies. The whole country celebrated. And then, 1 year later, everything collapsed again. January 1997, one of Korea's major conglomerates, a company ranked among the country's top 20 largest businesses, declared bankruptcy. That was the first domino. Over the next 11 months, one major company after another collapsed. Steel companies, alcohol companies, car companies, construction firms, retailers, financial institutions. Every time people turned on the news, another name had fallen. And on December 3rd, 1997, Korea officially requested a bailout from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. The IMF stepped in with emergency loans, but attached brutal conditions. More restructuring, more layoffs, more companies shut down. An entire generation of middle-class Korean families lost their jobs, their savings, and their homes almost overnight. It was the worst economic crisis since the Korean War. And then, Korea did it again. In December 1998, Korea repaid the first emergency installment of $1.8 billion. And on December 4th, 2001, Korea announced that it had fully repaid every dollar of its IMF loans, 3 years ahead of schedule. Of all the countries that have ever received IMF emergency funding, no country had ever recovered that fast. And then came 2009. Korea joined the OECD's Development Assistance Committee, the group of countries that give foreign aid to others. Korea was now officially an aid donor, the same country that the United States had called a bottomless pit in 1953, the same country whose people were eating grass roots in the 1960s, the country that General MacArthur said would need 100 years to recover. In 70 years, Korea had gone from receiving aid to giving it, the first country in modern history to make that journey. Germany's recovery after World War II had been called the Miracle on the Rhine. Korea's story needed its own name. The world gave it one, the Miracle on the Han River. Named after the river that runs through Seoul, the capital that was once a field of ash and is now one of the most dynamic cities on Earth. Now, I want to be honest with you. This story isn't just a simple success story. The rapid growth came with real costs. The gap between large corporations and small businesses widened enormously, and it still hasn't closed. The income gap between those at the top and those at the bottom grew sharper, especially after the IMF crisis. The relentless focus on economic performance created a culture of intense pressure in schools, in workplaces, in families. Young Koreans today are among the most educated in the world and among the most stressed. The burnout is real. The inequality is real. These aren't small footnotes. They're ongoing challenges that Korea is still trying to figure out. But here's what I keep coming back to. A country that had nothing, that was bombed flat, that had people going hungry in the 1960s, that was written off by the international community, that crashed again in 1997 and still came back. That country is now home to some of the world's most recognizable brands, music, cinema, and technology. That doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't happen in every country. That's what makes it a miracle. So I'll leave you with a question, one worth thinking about. What does it actually take for a country to rise like this? And what does a society have to give up along the way? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely love to hear your perspective. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.